Hi, welcome to the Ruin Keep. This is a unusual episode for the Ruin Keep. It is myself and a guest, Chaotic Stupid Media, otherwise known as Caden, otherwise known as Kevin.
Yes.
And he has joined me for a DM chat. We are here to talk about weekly session preparation, how I do it, how he does it, and hopefully everyone who's watching can learn something from that, or just think we're idiots, one or the other.
Either's fine.
Yeah. So just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I'm the DM of the Ruin Keep. I started as a dungeon master when I was about 13, 14 years old, and I didn't have any books. All I had was a friend who said, "This is amazing, you should try it, it's called D&D, and here's how it works." And then I got the Dungeon Master's Guide as a prize at school, much to the horror of some parents, I'm sure. And that was the first book I had, and so I improvised a lot of rules and things. And I've been running sessions off the back of that start for about 20-something years. Second edition, now 5th edition. And that entire time has been one universe, a series of campaigns set in that universe with one storyline. So that's my background, and this is Kevin.
Right, so I'm Kevin. By the way, I am fascinated by the fact that you have one universe for all that time.
I know, it's a bit insane. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm the Dungeon Master for Tales of Adeya, so I host that on my own Twitch channel. And I am also one of the hosts of Chaotic Stupid, which is a new podcast that I do with a friend of mine who also plays on Tales of Adeya. We're both longtime Dungeon Masters, not as long as you, Simon, but we're trying to get up there. And I've been in love with storytelling pretty much most of my life. So I've been developing my role-playing and DM abilities for like 10 years now, not even realizing when I started in World of Warcraft role-playing, of all things, that I was doing that, but this is where it led me, and I think it was always inevitable. So for the past 4.5 years, when I discovered, well, I mean, I always knew about D&D, but when I really got into D&D and now TTRPGs in general, it's just been so eye-opening in terms of, the stories that you can tell. So I've just been in love ever since. And I think that's pretty much me, or all you need to know about me in this context anyway.
Cool. So we've prepared questions for each other.
Yes.
The format of this is going to be questions that we've shared in a Google Doc that we know we're both asking. And that's kind of like a warm-up and a bit of interesting chat about preparation. And then we're going to follow that up with some mystery questions, which neither of us know the other is going to ask, to see what kind of surprises we can pull. So I'm just going to open the doc. Oh, hey, Beluga. How you doing?
Hey,
Yeah, I
nice to have you.
wish I qualified as a kid. I think those days might be over, but I'll do my best. All right. So, first question for you, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
How much has your weekly prep changed now that you're streaming?
Right. Honestly, I thought about that one a bit, and frankly, not that much. I think the main thing is that it's actually forced me to be a little more concise with everything. Because what I used to do, and this is more, I suppose, my development in general as a dungeon master, but when I started out, and I started with quite extensive prep for short sessions, and then my sessions kept getting longer because of, we were having fun and the players were enjoying it. And at my peak, I was writing 12, 13 pages per session of prep. And it was a lot. And now I've kind of, just because of time and being more experienced, I've begun to dial that down because I don't need as many handholds. But also because of streaming, as you know, we need to set up a lot of things that are not for the game itself. So I need to give myself time to actually be able to do those things. And that's why I've kind of really condensed it to the core things that I need. And actually for a while, once I started streaming, what I was doing was handwriting my notes, because when I'm handwriting, I can only write down what's necessary. I don't, because I type 130 words per minute. I don't write
Your hand
130
gets
words per
tired.
minute. Yeah, exactly. So I was like, I'm gonna handwrite it so that I force myself to only write down really the highlights, and then, you know, kind of force myself into the situation where I have to just deal if I haven't written something specific down, which has really worked out because I think I'm experienced enough to handle it. But for a long time, I wasn't sure if I was. So I kind of, you know, let myself realize that, you know, I can do these things that I thought were impossible before for me to do, such as extensive improvisation and things like that. But do you mind if I bounce that question right back to you? Because I'm very curious for you as well.
I'm completely the same when it comes to preparing for the stream itself. It seems like there's an infinite number of tasks that you could always improve your stream. You could always have better graphics, better text overlays, or all the rest of it. So for those who've joined us who haven't seen the standard room and keep episodes, Kevin is currently occupying Zamar's spot in the archway. And
wait, I can pull off a Zamar. I can just hide over here.
Yeah. So yeah, there's always a load of streaming stuff. Absolutely. So that's a massive change. I agree. When I came into the stream, I wanted to try and keep it exactly the same as I normally do. So the biggest change really has been that I'm now getting some sort of feedback from the audience, I guess. So, and I'm watching the stream back. So as soon as I went online, I started recording. So when we were playing D&D online, I started recording the sessions anyway and watching them back.
Right.
Because it's really useful to learn about your own DM style, how you can improve and all that. But with streaming, now you've got your stream, you've got you, and you've got chat. And you can kind of, it's quite interesting. You can get quite a lot of information from both those things on how to improve and how to make the session better. So I think that's probably the biggest change.
Yeah. So a quick follow-up on that. Not in our prepared questions, but when you watch it back, what do you watch for? Because I haven't personally done that sort of thing where I go back, mainly because my sessions are also much longer than yours, I think.
Yeah, mine are 2 hours.
Yeah. And for me, it's, you know, when I easily go to 4 hours, and then it's iffy to watch it back with all the time that I don't have. So I'm curious what you look for, because maybe I can, you know, copy that a little bit and see if I can look for certain things in my own stream.
So one of the things that I always look for, there is one thing I'm not very good at. So something I picked up watching other streams, watching other DMs, and especially Critical Role with Matt Mercer, is whenever a player says or does something, there's an immediate reaction in the world. And the DM, in this case Matt Mercer, is kind of being the person who tells the player what is changing in that world. Now, in sessions in the past, for the years that I've been DMing, the players have been a bit more meta, and so when they say something, I didn't always think it needed a reaction. I didn't always think you need to say, "Oh, this thing happens," but actually, if you do always make sure there's one small change based on what they've said or done, it makes such a huge difference to the story, I think. And that was something I noticed when I first started watching myself. And now I keep an eye on that. I'm like, oh no, I forgot to react to that one thing, that tiny thing that player said. So it's kind of picking up on things I know I'm bad at, and then trying to see other things that I hadn't thought about, where I go, oh wow, I really need to improve that, or work on that thing.
That makes sense, actually. Maybe I'll take notes during my own sessions and, like, you know, not timestamps, but like when this was happening, and I can look that up and see how I would have done that differently. That's a good point. Already learning.
Talking about streams. So we've got Candor Art in chat. So hi Candor, thanks for joining us.
Hi Candor.
All right, cool. So let's go with another question then. What are the routine tasks you do each week when you're preparing a session?
Right.
That stay the same.
That's difficult because, as my name suggests, I am incredibly chaotic in everything I do. You know, there is a method to the madness, but it's my method, and it only works for me. I think the only routine task that I have every single time that I prepare is that there has to be at least one useful piece of information provided for players. Like, I want every session, because especially with the time that we spend of about 3.5 hours of actual gameplay, maybe 4 even, I want them to come out of that, even if we spend the whole session just role playing in a bar and doing almost nothing that, progresses the plot.
Yeah.
I want to give them something that expands their knowledge of what they care about in the world. So I know my players really well, and I use that to kind of say, okay, even if they did indeed spend 4 hours, which we did actually last session, we spent most of that time in a tavern, but I will still find a way to kind of, I don't want to say shoehorn, because I don't force it on my players, but at the same time I contrive the circumstances to make sure that they are either interrupted, or that they discover, or that somebody comes to talk to them about something that will, give a minor reveal and kind of at least changes their perspective on something, so that they come away with, oh, hey, we need to keep this in mind for next time. And that's a really important part of my prep, because that's usually where I start. Because I can't prep for much except, the things that we know will in some way be in there. So I go, okay, I know that I want to at least provide them with this information, and these are the methods with which I may be able to do so. And then I just look for the moment in the session where it may be the most appropriate. And sometimes I do it really early when I see the opportunity, and sometimes it's like the last 10 minutes, somebody, jumps in, and it kind of sets up a cliffhanger, because new information is a really fun kind of setup to end on, especially when they've been talking for a while and there's not really a clear, oh, this should be the end of the session moment. Then I create it with that information. So I think that's pretty much the only routine task that I have, really, because I do everything else differently every single time, pretty much.
So you mentioned the tavern. Without giving too much away, how much did you know they would be in the tavern before the session? So you already had the setting in mind, or
yes. Okay. So what happened last time when they were in that sort of elite tavern, with societal elites and that sort of thing, what happened there was that they'd accepted a mission to save the person that they were with, and that person was always going to invite them to come with her to the tavern, and I knew that they wanted to speak with her because they had a contract with her and such. Right. So I could essentially assume, even though the players had all the choices to just refuse, but I essentially knew that they would come along, because they are very curious players. That's why I love playing with them. So I can kind of assume, okay, they will do that, and I knew they would be in the tavern, and then I already have this kind of closed off environment. I actually really love taverns and similar social environments where I can, pluck down or plant several NPCs that have interesting things, and then the players just get to choose, okay, we're going to talk to them, we're going to talk to them, a little bit here, a little bit there. And through those, sort of, it's like a sort of index. They get an index when they enter of, these are the people here, and have fun. And then you just tell me what they want to do, and they can do it in any order that they want.
Like a mini sandbox, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So there's a follow-up question from Adalbert, one of the players in the Runkeep. Hi, Matt. With all the things you prepare, even routinely prepare week after week, how much of the session is the chaotic madness because of the players? That's a really good question, Matt, and it's partly your fault. Yeah, so do you want to
Sure, I'll hop on first, but you have to promise, because I'm also really curious about how much of what happens is planned or not for you. Yeah. But in my case, I think it's a weird thing where I've always been good at kind of reading people. So even with my players, I can understand them and the way that they look at their characters quite well. And that's, I think, every DM has certain strengths, and that's one of mine. Right. So I can kind of use that. I never railroad them, but they also never go completely off track, because I give them enough things to care about that they love, that they gave me as well, to know that, okay, of all the possible options, it's not suddenly going to go travel to another country and, ride an elephant. That's not what's going to happen. They're going to care about some of these things, and I know that some of these things have been presented as being the most urgent, so they'll focus on those for the moment. So it's actually not that chaotic. It's more that my players are such avid role players that I don't know how the conversations will go. So then you get interesting moments, such as 2 sessions ago, our resident dwarf watched a nobleman greeting the monk of the party who was pretending to be a lady, with a kiss on the hand and a bow and everything, and then she had just extended her hand like this, and then the dwarf had to introduce himself to the nobleman, and he did the same thing, and he was very confused. The nobleman was. The dwarf was really confused.
He thought that was a greeting.
Yeah, and then he just stood there like this, and then he just turned his hand as if that was the traditional greeting of his people. And then he rolled such a high deception check. So things like that will just kind of come together, and that's my favorite part, because I know the general lines that the players will walk, but then they just come up with the most amazing, crazy things like this, and it just blows me away. So that's kind of where the chaos comes in. But it's not, unmanageable chaos. It's exactly the kind of chaos that we all enjoy, that, enriches the story and makes the world feel more alive and open. So, yeah, it's not that bad, actually.
Yeah, and to answer your question, Matt, from my point of view, how much of the session is chaotic madness because of the players? I think all of it. Well, my approach to D&D is I'm trying to create a world that the players can live in. So whatever they choose to do within that world is up to them. And obviously, when we do session zero type stuff, we work out what kind of world and what kind of character you want to be. So you're not going to set up and be a baker or something, and it's like baking session every week. But having said all that, what I do look for is players that are going to run with the world, the story that's going on in the background to the world, the characters that they meet, and the kind of opportunities that I present to them. So I do expect players to kind of pick up on things that they want to do and get involved with the world. But once all of that is prepared, I'm just expecting the players to go off and be crazy. And I kind of I'm exactly the same as you, Kevin. I love the fact that players will improvise, be creative, do stuff you just can't imagine or prepare for.
Yeah.
And some of the best sessions are always the ones where, as a DM, you're like, interesting, I hadn't expected that. Yeah. So, but going back to your sort of bouncing the other question back, routine tasks. So this is, I teased you when we prepared for this chat. I teased you with this, not bombshell, but like a surprise. Yeah. I have an unusual approach to preparing for a session because I try to memorize everything. So I want to go into a session with all the NPC names, all the plot details, all the motivations, all the interactions, the factions, everything that I think is going to be important for that session in my head.
Wow.
And as I get older, that gets harder. But my aim is to go in and be able to keep eye contact with everyone all the time, as much as possible. And to interact with people knowing the background to everything.
That's incredibly admirable. Wow.
So my weekly prep is I sit down and work out the details of stuff. So I'll write documents and put together stats and all the rest of it. But then I'm trying to spend... So I do that on a Sunday. And then Monday, Tuesday, because our session's on a Tuesday night. Monday, Tuesday, I then spend time memorizing their stuff. And I have various sort of methods of doing that, but the most important method is if there are key scenes that I think will happen, key interactions. I know they're going to meet this character or they're going to attack this person or whatever. Then I rehearse that scene in my head over and over again until I know exactly what the NPCs are likely to do, what the impact might be, what all the sort of consequences of player actions.
Wow.
So that when the session starts and people start doing stuff, I'm ready to react because I've already rehearsed it.
Wow, that's incredibly impressive. You're right. That is a bombshell, to me at least. Because, one of my pre-written questions was, do you write any particular scenes, dialogue, or introductions specifically, and why? So I guess I already have an answer to that, but that's still incredibly impressive. And I kind of love it because I've always dislike the moments where I have to really dive into my notes.
Yeah, me too.
But but do you also think that it then influences the way that you kind of develop the story, in the sense that you wouldn't want an overload of things to have to remember? Because I could imagine that
Yeah.
with that particular approach, maybe like large metropolitan cities would be a nightmare to run if they could walk into every shop and walk into any particular
there's a limit.
situation.
So part of the reason why I have this approach is my belief is that the human brain is probably the most powerful device you can have. It's like it doesn't matter how good your PC is and how good your text searches are and whatever, or how many sort of crazy pathways you set up in some kind of weird wiki. The brain is better at finding stuff and retrieving stuff than any other thing. So that's kind of why I do it. Yeah. But there's a limit, and I can't memorize a city. So there are certain things where I'm going to have a lookup table or a list or whatever. But it's kind of it's all a lot of it is like scene setup. So if I know there's a location, then I make sure that I've memorized the details of the location. If there's a character,
that's really
then
cool.
Yeah. So it's key stuff.
Yeah. So I think I wanted to achieve the same thing in the past, of being able to be more interactive with the players instead of being looking through my notes constantly, which did become a problem obviously when I had 12 pages. It was I actually printed them out most frequently because at least it was easier to mark things and then go to a particular page. I even used words, insert the table of contents, just to have an overview of what's on each page. Then while writing, I had to give everything headers. But what I do now is actually, I don't prepare even particular scenes anymore, because I feel that, but maybe this is just through practice, but I have really practiced myself in saying things in a unique way, because I know the general gist of a scene, right? Even if it's an important one, I know the general impression that I want to give. And so I've kind of, I don't think it's probably the same quality as if you pre-make something and prepare something, but it's good enough where I can say, okay, I know what the scene is going to be, and all I need is just the general idea of it, and then specific facts, and that's all I write down. So actually my prep has, to achieve the same thing, has just kind of evolved to generally cover a location, actually mostly locations or conflict situation, right? Like moments where something in the story will change or evolve in some way. So I just need the basic facts that the players can discover or that will affect them in some way. And outside of that, I now not improvise, because I have so much already in the back of my head about how the world is supposed to function that I use that to kind of achieve the same thing. But maybe I'll start memorizing a few dialogues at least, because you need the really good monologues, or the really good introductions, or the really good scene settings to just be there. My problem is that I write my introduction to the whole session the hour beforehand usually.
And the other danger is that so if there's a scheduling problem, for instance, I mean obviously with a stream it's a bit more regular, but if a session gets cancelled, literally the effort is wasted. Like all of that memorization, I'd have to do it again for the following week or whatever. So there's certain risks involved. And then the other thing is that if the players never go there or never talk to that person or never do the thing you expect they're going to do, again, it's wasted.
That's true. Yeah.
But that's just kind of, that's the risk you take, I think.
But it still informs it, right? Because even if it never happens, but if they come there later, you know what you kind of prepared. So it helps inform the situation from a different perspective. So
I do also have a cheat sheet, but what I find is because of my memorization process, actually making the cheat sheet sticks certain things in my memory a bit better. So I have a bullet list of, like, say, if there's a list of things that are going to happen, I'll list them out, or if there are key plot points or informational characters, then I'll list those. But,
yeah. So, follow-up question from my side. Where do you start when you just, before you actually sit down on Sunday, or when you sit down on Sunday, where do you actually start with writing your sessions?
So, again, because I'm watching the streams and videos back from online play, it's super useful because you get that momentum back again.
That's true. Yeah.
of what were the players about to do. So the first thing I start with is, okay, now that they've done this thing, what are the consequences of that? What are the impact in the world around them that is going to make a difference this session? So my entire planning and story and adventure type stuff is based on consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So I have sort of a thread and I have hooks and all that sort of thing, but in the end it's this kind of snowball of the players did this, the players did this, the players did this, and each thing they do has this wave of consequences. So the first thing I do is sit down and say, right, last session, for instance, Zaymar has ridden off on the back of Alithia, who's currently a wolf, at full speed. What are the consequences of that? And that's so it's kind of looking at the impact of what they do, and then once I've thought about that, I then start thinking about the other characters in the world and what they're doing and what they want to do. And so I'm looking at the interactions that they might have with the party. And then I'll look at the most important things that I wanted to do with the story. So I have like a few key things that I want the players to discover or to fight or whatever. And if they're not heading in that direction, then I'll start thinking about, should I start steering them towards there, or should I?
Yeah. Do they need a nudge or not?
Yeah. And then once I've gone through all that thinking, that's when I'll start planning individual details, like, okay, so this NPC is going to turn up and so on.
Okay, interesting. I really like the part about consequences because, I mean, it seems such a natural thing to focus on, but still, I don't think it's necessarily the thing that everybody focuses on, and I definitely don't because, but in a weird way, what I do is I focus on the choices that I want to put before my players, you know? The things that I want them to deliberate about, whether significant or silly, but you know, that's where I probably start my creative process is, okay, this is the situation they find themselves in. And for example, last session they finished having just beaten off an ambush at night, and now they have prisoners. So I obviously want to put some kind of choice in front of them. I won't say what kind of choice because I already have an idea, but
I haven't got to that bit yet. No spoilers from last episode. I need
okay. No, I won't. But I want to put some kind of choice in front of them. So when I sit down, I go, okay, the next, and I call that a conflict, but you know, a conflict in the broadest sense of the word. I go, okay, what is the next thing that will make them conflicted in the situation, and that will inevitably, you know, feed into each other. To write more, but I like the focus on consequences from your side, and maybe that's something I want to do a bit more because I think that it's a really natural way to take what happened previously and continue to evolve that in the world. You know, I think everyone does it eventually, but when you put a focus on it, like you described, I could imagine that it really makes everything feel more weighty because you can see the results of what's happening, whether small or big, happening the next session. And yeah, I think actually thinking back now, probably some of the best sessions that I've had in the past have been sessions where I've subconsciously done that by in my session prep. So that's a really cool point, actually.
All right. So
sorry, processing.
That's okay. Next question: What takes the longest time in your prep usually?
Probably. The longest time, I would say probably actually I'm bouncing back and forth. I think I will say that the longest it takes is actually the thinking, the creative process up front, because I spend a lot of time what I like to call procrastinating, but it's not actually procrastinating.
Creative thinking.
It's exactly. It's just sitting there and kind of agonizing over the fact that I don't have anything on paper yet, and then it goes, okay, find that thing that I want to kind of really start with. So for example, the first choice that I want to put in front of them, and then just build it up from there. And I essentially go through the whole session that I think of the things that they may interact with, and I just go over to my head, okay, what are they going to be finding here? What are they going to be finding there? And usually that's a process that happens about every 2 or 3 weeks, because I will think about so many situations in that time that I essentially make 2 weeks of prep, and then the next week I only have to build it up a little bit more to fill out that session as well, because I always underestimate how much time everything's going to take.
Yeah, yeah, I still do.
Yeah, I think that's a natural dungeon master problem. So, but yeah, I think the sort of brainstorm is what definitely takes the longest for me. How about you?
Maps, for sure.
Oh yeah,
Creating a map is an incredibly time-consuming business for me, regardless of the tools that I use. I think partly because I want the map to look like my head. Whatever's in my head, I want it to be exactly like that on the map. So it takes ages, and sometimes you do something and then you just go, oh, fuck it, I'm not, I can't make it look like what I want, so I'm just going to move on. But that takes a long time. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned, consequences. If the players do something like, if there's an accelerated time and there's a lot of things happening in the background of the world, the consequences of all those things takes a very long time to calculate and kind of think about and then turn into practical changes around them.
Okay, yeah.
So
that makes sense.
It's almost like lots of cogs and gears of the world spinning. The more time that, say the players take a week's break or something because they're injured and need to recover or whatever it is.
Right.
Not that you get that in 5 now, but that week for me is the most intensive session prep ever because there's an entire week where the world is doing stuff. So that takes a long time for me.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that, and I think that's a really interesting point. Probably what I do is when I probably also what takes a lot of time is I sometimes have this need to find a eureka moment. I want to find that moment of, okay, I could run the session right now. It would be a fine session. Nothing wrong with it.
It wouldn't have that.
Exactly. You need that little magical moment where you go like, okay, I cannot wait for my players to see this. I think that one can also take up quite a bit of time. I'm seeing actually that we have some.
Yeah, we've got some other questions. So a question from Andrew. When designing the game world, once you've got the player input in session 0, do you start top down or bottom up? What is the scope of the world you're designed so far? So I'll start with that because
please do.
Andrew knows me quite well, and so he's asking because I think the way I work in my job is the same as the way I design my world. I do both at the same time. So my aim is to start with a broad thinking on the nation, the regional scale, and the tiny detail of this NPC. So often I will start with one character who's like a lowly sort of first level character, and the world in my head, and then my aim is to kind of bring the two levels together. So I'm constantly working until they meet in the middle, which is where the players are. So it's kind of that approach. So I do both at the same time, Andrew.
Makes a lot of sense.
How about you, Kevin?
I mean, you've seen my world, so in terms of scope, I think that's where it begins. My whole thing is that my world is enormous, right? I mean,
your map is huge. Yeah.
The continent that they're playing on right now, just for literal physical scale, it's 4,600 kilometers across, which is roughly, I looked it up, it's roughly the distance from London to Tehran in Iran.
Nice.
So, it's huge, and that is kind of probably where I start, but mainly just to be able to give the characters their appropriate backgrounds. I think that the environment tells so much about who a character is. So I want to at least be able to say, okay, this is the larger world that you live in. Then I immediately go down to the region, because when it's that big, I mean, I would literally have to write a campaign guide to define everything up front. So I don't do that. So what I did was I went to the regional level. I was like, okay, you guys are in this place. So that became the Republic. And there are these locations around it that could be relevant for your characters as backgrounds or whatever, but that's not where our story is going to be taking place. So I wrote really short write-ups for those. And once I was able to give my players sufficient background about where they were, then I was immediately at the local level of, okay, you're in this town, this is the group that you're a part of, this is your, let's figure out the reasons why you guys are together, what your mission is, and that's where we started. Because this campaign, for example, started from a one-shot as well. So I had, basically, at the higher levels, I had context that I required to be content with what I was offering my players, and then it was all to the local scale, and then I just build it out locally, because I have the framework around it, and then I just build it out as the players go. Okay, they're going to the capital now. Okay, I have to figure out the capital, so let's make them travel for a week. That gives me two sessions of preparation before they'll actually arrive, and I will need to know at least the basics of what they can do in the capital. So I think that's pretty much my process. Is more top down, but I definitely understand, if you have a good idea that happens for an NPC or for an item or something that will make a great story, then that develops together until you can connect them to one another. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well.
Well, the reason I kind of do that is for me, at the heart of everything is character. Both the player characters as the focal point, but also when it comes to your world, the characters in the world almost represent all of your thoughts and your kind of your plot points and everything. It all coalesced into one person. Yeah. So for me, the characters probably get designed first. As soon as I've got a broad idea of a region or a world. Right. There was another question. What is the scope of the world you've designed so far? It's the second part to Andrew's question. So I've there's something I can't talk about, but in terms of what the players know, there's 2 main continents with a lot of sort of small islands and things in between. I've got countries and key people in those countries, and I've got a history that goes back 6,000 years. But it's not a detailed history. It's just as much as I need for the story. And I've got the same approach to you, Kevin. You kind of have to do a sort of Google Maps approach. So you start off with like very zoomed out, very sort of sketchy detail, and then where the players are, you kind of zoom until you've got your village and your house and your shops and whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think scope-wise, we're pretty much in the same boat there. I mentioned the continent already. There is a secondary continent that the players are aware of as existing, but it's a sort of new world scenario. So it's not populated by anyone from this continent. It's really far away, and supposedly it's larger as well, which, is a fun headache for me writing the campaign guide later. But that is out there as a sort of, just in case they want something completely different, then let them go and find the other continent. They can do that if they want to. That would be a fun adventure, but that's completely up to them. And beyond that, I mean, it's a large continent, and I have, I think, officially 28 sovereign states or nations or city-states defined.
Wow, that's more than me for sure.
That's a lot. It's a lot. But it's, the EU has 27, so I was like, okay, that's a decent number.
Oh, okay, no, that makes sense. Yeah. There's another question from Matt. With all the planning in the world, sorry, no, that's not how he meant it. With all the planning in the world, how much of your session ends up being winging it to some degree?
It's a good question. Well, I suppose I'll go first and say that it is both. I am both significantly winging it and not at all, in a weird way, because I've informed myself so much. So I mean, I recently put out that video. I literally wrote a 14-minute lecture about some detail in history that's important, but it's this kind of backdrop event, and I have all that information and more already in my head. I've thought about the way that this society has evolved, and basically in my creative process of creating the places that the players are in now, I already defined so many things that can inform who a character is, that I can play the stereotypes endlessly, because there are so many stereotypes I can get through that the players will never meet them all anyway. So I don't necessarily need to have a super developed character or a super developed situation to be able to play the session. And so that's what kind of where I come in with. I just want to put choices or interesting events in front of my players and just see what they do with it. And the rest I can wing it, well, quote unquote wing it, because I already have enough information that I'm not really winging it at all. So I think that would be my response there. Hi Tailmonger. Hi Chris Harris.
Hi Tailmonger.
Hi Bador.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for me, Matt. How much of it is winging it? I guess in some ways I would say that I prepare as much of the world as I can, and then the express intent is that the session is winging it, knowing all of the detail that I've prepared. So I'm not really... The way that I handle set pieces or significant events or the equivalent of a boss battle or whatever is slightly different. That it's always got to be a consequence of what the players have been heading towards. So I can plan a sort of consequence at the end thinking, oh, this would be really cool. If they do all these things, they'll end up here. But I allow so much flexibility that it's never a certainty. And so I expect winging it all the way through. Like you, I almost don't see it as winging it because I already know what the characters are like and what their motivations are and what they want. So, for instance, any interaction with an NPC is not winging, it's improvisation, I guess.
Yeah, if you want to, I guess, make us really wing it, it would have to be, do something that your character would never do. So if you're really nice, go stab someone in the back suddenly, or the opposite. If you're really mean, then go cuddle someone and be super nice. Then that would probably be an unexpected situation. But beyond that, I completely agree that it would be hard to really, really be forced to only improvise.
The exception is because of the flexibility and the sandbox nature of both our worlds, I guess. If the players suddenly decide for whatever reason to go to a town or a village or a city or a country that I haven't got a lot of the detail on, then there'll be a lot of winging it involved then. But within that session, I will try to encourage the players not to do that without forcing them, just because I don't like winging it and I'd rather have the time to prepare and be able to run it normally. But if they end up going there anyway and doing that thing, then I'll wing it. So
So in that situation, if you are forced to kind of into this unfamiliar setup and you haven't been able to prepare that particular thing, I mean, what I do is I will come up with one thing because you always have a slight idea of where they are. I will come up with the one situation that I know will take until the end of the session to resolve, or not even then resolve, and I will just play that out. So that I essentially, that's my form of, okay, if you can travel there instantly, because otherwise I will use travel.
Yeah, teleport can cause trouble. Yeah.
Right? But when they teleport, I just go like, okay, you did something that somehow inconveniences you enough that I have time until the next session to prepare this entire situation. And I find that's a nice little trick, like a trick of the camera when you're filming a sitcom, just like a scene switch and, you just skip over the hard part. Until you can prepare it.
That's a really good idea. I used to do things like that, but I found it works really well in that session, and then it gives you the time to prepare. But then it creates, for me anyway, because of the consequence management, it creates a lot of consequences that I then have to roll into the story, and that creates a lot of headaches. So I tend to...
Yeah, that's fair.
What I try to do is take myself out of the equation. So if I'm not prepared, then I try to let it go anyway, because otherwise it gets really complicated in the future. It's like a reality that starts to break because as a DM you've kind of tried to push it in it's
that's true. And I mean, I don't mean come up with something completely incredible that wouldn't happen there otherwise. If they for example, if they do a sudden teleport, this happens on Critical Role quite a bit in season 2, where they just teleport in without permission, for example. And then that's a neat way to kind of have this little bureaucratic hiccup that takes longer to resolve, and they can talk to a few characters that you didn't necessarily prepare, but etc. Because usually, at least in my experience, the divergence into something unexpected doesn't happen until later in the session. It's never, the first 10 minutes that they go, oh, let's go do something completely different than what we had planned and talked about previously. But it's usually because they discover some piece of information that they take differently than I had expected.
Yeah.
So, for example, what happened was they took 2 people prisoner that I had totally expected them to kill, like way early in the campaign. And so for that session, I had to just kind of improvise who these people were because I hadn't given them that much. They were just generic bad guys. But then they became brothers, and one was protective, and the other one was this. And they took him to a warehouse to interrogate. And then I decided, okay, I had this other plot point prepared, so I threw that in there as a sort of, so they kind of became besieged in the warehouse overnight. And that kept them busy while they dealt with the bad guys, but that distracted them enough that I had until the next session to continue preparing. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't advocate breaking the world, but I can understand that it would perhaps create too many unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's the fragility of my method. There are certain restrictions that I have to face up to. So there's a question from Zaymar, Mr. Harris. Can you talk about surprises for the players? I think that's quite an interesting question. Do you want to talk about how you create, deal with, or otherwise engineer surprises for the players?
Surprises. Well, I think one of the benefits that I get to really enjoy is that my players are so incredibly involved in the world that even I can even surprise them with, for example, putting an NPC in front of them that they hadn't officially met in the game before, but that they had vaguely integrated was in their backstory or something, or is somehow connected to some part of their backstory, and that will already surprise them enough. So I have quite a bit of leeway, and I can surprise them in many ways because they give me that freedom to kind of run with their background and really introduce elements at random when it seems appropriate for the story. So I think those are my favorite surprises so far, especially dream sequences or otherworldly sequences where they have to deal with some part of their past. That usually surprises them very positively because they get to engage with what they came up with, but make it really, really concrete and immediate. And that's some of my favorite roleplay that we've done so far, and they seem to really enjoy it as well.
Right, cool.
How about you?
So I have a slightly different approach. The reason he asked this question is because he knows how I like to surprise my players. So part of being a DM, and you sort of touched on this earlier, is understanding people and getting into the heads of your players. Like, you need to understand what players want from a session, what they're going to enjoy, the kind of boundaries they have in the experience that they want. But with that skill comes other abilities, which are a little more sinister, and that is the ability to manipulate players into doing something or saying something or wanting something. And it's just a natural consequence of knowing how people tick.
Yeah.
That is super useful for bad guys. If you want to surprise a player, I find the best method is to have a bad person, monster, whatever, who is intelligent enough to know they need the players to do X. And it makes for super interesting storylines and interactions with the world, and arcs for each player character, because they can want something so much they don't even realize you made them want it. And if you can achieve that, then you're basically kind of role-playing the kind of adversary that players begin to enjoy facing up to. So after they've killed off your bog standard wolves or whatever, they're going to start to get hungry for something more challenging. And if your adversary is going to see what your character wants and what the aims are and start manipulating you through the interactions that go on, the players begin to realize, oh yeah, we're not just facing something with a lot of hit points and damage. We're facing something that is going to really challenge me.
That's very true.
So I like to do that.
I mean, I think I love that approach, and I could imagine that you're quite skilled at it. I think that's also inherent in the whole political intrigue that I've put into my world, But there it's even more a question of who's the villain, because nobody's doing everything right. Everyone's kind of involved in something, because that's how people are in powerful positions. So they do, everyone's involved in, I don't know, shifty trades, or someone's faking permits, or someone's, smuggling things or whatever, and they're all in some things, even their patrons. So they spend half the time just wondering who is actually our enemy here. And then when that reveal comes, it's never the person they expect. It's never that guy that was being super duper evil, but actually it's the one that was manipulating you and pushing you in the right direction that they needed you to go. And then, and I love that, because they go from kind of being unsure about this person, and they've spent some time getting to trust them, and then reluctantly they've given their trust, and then it goes, oh, I hate that person so much. That's my favorite. So,
I was hoping that was the case, because I've been seeing some sort of elements of the intrigue appear that I'm curious about. So I'm looking forward to seeing your characters go through that.
Thank you.
That sounds quite cool. We actually had loads of questions prepared for each other, and everyone in chat is so brilliant that we got tons of questions just from chat.
You guys are amazing.
And I'm really sorry if we miss someone who has a question. So Saunders asked, do you ever take something a player does or says during a session to incorporate into a later session down the line? This question, Saun, is a focus of attention on Reddit constantly, where DMs are on one side or the other. If a player has an idea and says, "Oh, I reckon the person behind all this is thinking this," do you, as a DM, if it's better than your idea, do you take it? So do you want to address that?
Sure. I mean, yes, I'll take it. But never in the way that the player is expecting, right? The player will make a great suggestion, and then I still have to twist it into something that I want to do. So that it still feels unexpected, kind of also tying into the whole surprise thing. I still want to delight my players with, oh, I recognize this, but it's just a little bit different and fits in maybe just a little bit better even than I expected. And that's like one of my favorite things to do with that. But I absolutely take what they say and do on board with. I mean, that's the whole principle also behind like puzzles, where I don't know the answer, and I go with the best solution that my players present me with. Don't do it often, but it's fun when it happens.
Interesting. Okay.
How about you?
So I try and run a simulation as close as possible. The idea being that the world exists kind of almost regardless that the players are inside it. And so when the players start to interact with it, my intention is that the interactions are as natural as a fantasy world would be.
Yeah.
So my answer is I try not to. I really don't want to. If they say something that I'd already thought about or planned, then that's cool. If they say something where I go, wow, that's really cool, I wish I'd thought of that, there's a massive human desire to fulfill that the expression of that idea. It's very tempting, and I try not to. I'm sure I have done. I'm sure it's popped back into my head at some point, and I've gone, oh, that's a really good idea I just had. But no, the answer is as much as possible, no, because just because a player has said something or a character has said something shouldn't affect the world at all. Unless somebody's listening, an NPC heard them, or there's some other reason why what they said or think might have an impact on the world. But otherwise, no, I try not to. But that's just the way I try and run it.
I would argue it's also a matter of a degree to which things change.
Right.
Because, the typical things that I was thinking of when I said I take it on board is usually when my players are speculating about this, some part of the grand design, and then I go like, oh, that would be interesting to somehow incorporate. And usually it becomes an add-on. So I continue to have my structure that I built, and then I just put something on top and go like, okay, this would be a super fun thing to kind of nod towards. It's like a sort of cameo of their ideas that comes in.
I don't want to give the impression that I think the way I do it is better, because I don't think it is. I think it's more, if you sort of give a nod to the player's idea, I think that for them, that can be incredibly fulfilling. And I've seen in the sort of Reddit arguments, a lot of DMs who said, yeah, this player said this thing, and I incorporated it into the world, and they loved it, and it was their favourite session or whatever. And I think that can be brilliant for your planning and so on. It's just, I try to have a sort of integrity in the world where I'm almost neutral. And I think that means that I can't listen to the players. I love hearing them talk. It's like my favourite thing ever is like hearing players discuss what they think is happening or why. But yeah, I try not to use it.
I mean, we could enact out the rest of the Reddit argument and go, okay, but maybe it doesn't jeopardize the integrity of your world. But I suppose people can actually read Reddit for that. But I think, I agree with you that neither approach is better or worse. It's just, the way that you like, and I think it's more of a scale as well, right? You can be super kind of protective of that integrity, or you can kind of sit in the middle, or you can be completely freeform and just take ideas all the time and completely shape the path that the players are on with that as well. I definitely lean more towards your side as well, because, I have this enormous world and things are developing constantly on their own. That's probably why I actually take some of their ideas and incorporate them, because I go, okay, I already have so many things that I'm doing, so I want to make sure that they feel that, they contribute at least a little bit to the world, because otherwise it can feel a bit overwhelming, which is, I guess, a sort of symptom of the size of this world. And I don't mean just the physical size, but I make it feel big, right? They get news from far away, and they meet traders, and they meet people that have traveled from far away, and they meet so many different NPCs and people. I mean, some sessions I play 12 to 15 different characters in a row, because they meet
in one
all
session.
of them. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, when you it's less prevalent at the moment, but in the past I've run 6-7 hour sessions repeatedly, week after week, and in that it's just impossible. If they're in a city, they're gonna meet with their employer.
Oh yeah, I guess
the bad guys, and it just happens. So in those situations, I just lean a bit away from only my stuff and go, okay, you just made a really funny note, so in this shop there's going to be something that you just mentioned and stuff like that.
So more questions. Thanks everyone for engaging so much with this. So Harathia, Chris Roberts from my sessions has asked, have you ever taken an idea and swapped it for your own? Which he's asking me, I guess, but not intentionally, no. I think there's been a few times when I've gone, oh shit, was that my idea? And I wasn't sure. But those kind of things tend to be down the road anyway. Like, it's rare for an idea that someone expresses that could have a consequence straight away. It's normally a bit later on. I don't think so. Was there another question from Mr. Roberts? When you think as much about the plot and NPCs involved as Simon does it? Oh no, it's not a question. Okay, cool. So, shall we try to get into our surprise questions?
Yeah, sure.
We're getting to the end of it.
Go quickly. I mean, honestly, I think I have covered a few of the ones that I had actually prepared as surprises, because they were a part of our discussion. So perhaps you can surprise me still and knock me.
All right. So this is a question that's very close to my heart. This is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. How do you prepare to create atmosphere in your game?
Ooh, that's a good question. Atmosphere. Well, recently I've started working more on music again, but that's still kind of iffy. Like, I don't like to rely on music for atmosphere, because it's not always guaranteed that the players are listening to it, or that it will necessarily have the same effect on them. Outside of that, I think it's a lot about wording. Like setting the scene, what you discussed earlier. Making sure that I describe the lighting and the smells, and I want to incorporate many of the senses at once. So that's a big one to set the atmosphere. And then on top of that, I like to also modulate the way that I speak.
Right.
And the words that I choose, even when setting the scene. So I will slow down my voice, or I'll pick it up if it's like a tense scene. And I will also use different words, like shorter words in really tense situations, to make it feel like, chop, 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 chop the whole time, like that it happens really quickly. And slowly, if there's like this really either social situation that's either really emotional or really tense as well, and all those sorts of things kind of come together to set the atmosphere there and play off of the characters as well. And it's something I'm getting better at every time, because I learn to take more time and really focus on what I want to be saying, so that helps a lot.
So is that something that, how do you structure that as prep? How do you write down notes on that, or how do you do it?
Yeah, I do actually. I tend to, so when I go into the session prep and I try to find those moments where they have to make choices, or where they're presented with information that will lead to choices, I will usually envision, okay, what setting is that in? You know, is this a thieves guild? Is it a cozy tavern, a busy tavern? Is it out in the city? Is it, because that's something I can usually predict, because I know where the NPCs will be when they could potentially meet them. And also the nature of what is being revealed will typically set the atmosphere, because regardless of what a place actually looks like, it's your emotional state going into it that can determine a lot of how you experience it.
Right,
so
yeah.
It's always my point to play more on the players, and really the players, not just the player characters, but the player's emotional state, to kind of get them in the sense of, okay, this is something we should be dreading, or this is something that we should be tense about or happy about. And you know, kind of in the lead up to it, I already use also language and things like that. And sometimes it really comes down to, in the prep, I have a description written, and I'll even have like specific words that I want to repeat in what I'm saying, to, you know, subconsciously send the message of, okay, it's this, or it's like this, or it's like this.
Is that a sort of Darren Brown type? If you keep inserting these words, then they'll start thinking it.
I think so, yeah. I think so, a little bit, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, the reason I asked is, for me, it's magic dust. It's like something you really need to have in your session, but there's no guaranteed way of doing it. So I'm constantly sort of experimenting with different approaches, because I rehearse a lot of the session in my head over and over again. I'm sort of playing out how I think the players will react and what they'll do. So I'm at that point, I'm thinking of how I can insert certain atmospheres to create different emotions.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I have a suggestion for you that my friend Nicola, who hosts Chaotic Stupid with me, does. He does this amazing thing where he actually sets the scene, and I'm sure people will know this because I think some of the community creators do this as well, where he sets the scene like in a television show. So it starts with, or like the start of a book, where, so for example, you're soaring along with an eagle and you see the city in the distance, and then your vision drops, and then, you know, you actually literally have the curtain call and you have the chapter title coming into view, and he describes it like you're watching a television. And through those descriptions, that can really set the scene of, okay, because that's the way that most of us typically interact with this kind of fantasy atmosphere. So it's the easiest way to actually get people into that mindset sometimes, because we can easily recognize it. And you know, he runs one shots for me sometimes, and I love it. It's so atmospheric and immersive, because I go along in that description and I really follow along with it. So I definitely recommend that. I don't do it myself because I just can't do it consistently enough, and it feels like a rip-off as well, and I have my own thing, but it's a beautiful way of doing it. So if you're still experimenting, I mean, I would recommend that one for sure.
Yeah, I'm sort of aware of that, as I haven't focused and deliberately done it, so yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about. I've been aware of the shift from like people reading a lot of fantasy to watching a lot of fantasy, and therefore being influenced by visual more. But this same question was asked, or a similar one was asked to Matt Mercer at one of the panels.
Oh yeah,
and he made a really interesting point that you should try and focus on each sense, which I found very useful. That you should focus on smell, sound, sight, and I've noticed that some DMs. I'm trying to think if you do this. I think you do a little bit, and I completely don't for a different reason. You focus on the emotional state that somebody might be in, like how they're feeling at the time, like tense or surprised or whatever.
Yeah, I guess I do, but I do it like I think I suggest it, right? I think I say things like, you might be feeling, because I'm very cautious about telling people what they feel, except when there's a very clear reason why. But yeah, I think I do actually. You're right about that.
Yeah, I've been watching another stream where the DM gives a lot of emotional input into what the character's feeling. So they'll say, "Oh, you wake up and you're terrified of X," and I've always run it sort of. I've created the world and the NPCs, and then there's a barrier I don't step across unless the world is affecting the player character.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't normally do the emotional thing, but I think that's quite an interesting approach as well. But your stream is much more, as I mentioned to you directly, that your stream is much feels like a narrated book in a way. It's kind of it's like everyone describing what's happening in a much more a narration, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, true. And I think honestly that the emotional state, the reason that I started doing that, now that I'm thinking about it, right, because it's something that just occurred because I started doing that randomly at some point, but I think it's because I want to acknowledge as a storyteller that regardless of how well I set up my world and regardless of how well my players will role play, they will never understand every situation perfectly from the get-go. And then I find it easier to address the situation from a perspective of, okay, this is what I would expect you to be feeling, or what I think your characters might be feeling looking at this. But if you have a different reaction, go ahead. But, then they can approach it at least, or they can understand what the sort of intention of the setup is, So, for example, you might feel horrified to see the corpse is, okay, that corpse is definitely not just a regular dead person, but there's something horrifying about it. So they can still have a, emotionally neutral reaction if the character is like slightly detached or whatever. But at least they understand that even that detached character can maybe have the insight into the situation to understand that others may be feeling that way. So in that case, because I do acknowledge that it's sort of not unwelcome input, but it's definitely borders on the verge of taking agency away. A little bit. And I hate that. Like, I never want, because my story is about choices. So if you take agency away, what's the point in your choices? But in those situations, I find it's justifiable in order to kind of, communicate directly to the players, this is what you're seeing, and please go ahead and make of it what you will.
Okay. So I said to Kevin when we first talked about this that we'll aim for 45 minutes.
Yep, that was a lovely aim.
And that I'm really strict on time. But actually, I think that this has been so useful that it was worth going on a bit longer. But I feel like we should do one more question, and then it seems that if there's a lot more ground to cover, then we can do another stream on a similar topic. But my final question is, give me an instant of preparation that went poorly in a session. What did you learn?
Oof. Oh, I'll need a minute. I'll need a minute to think about that, because...
Yeah, so will I. I wrote the question and I was like, oh, shit, I need to think about an answer myself now.
Yeah. Let me see. I think... Thinking back over 4.5 years of things, I think what... probably the most notable part that went poorly that I had actually prepared is that at one point my players, so this is my first campaign, this is already 3 years ago, I think. One of my players had been very insistent about finding magical items, and they knew that it's, magic item shops are not common in this world, so it's not like you can walk into every big city and just buy something. So they were still being insistent. We were still kind of not fresh. We were playing for a year already, but it was still, strangely enough, that can still be enough time to still be getting to know each other on certain aspects of the game. And they were very insistent. So I wasn't being spiteful, but I wanted to play with them a little bit to kind of, temper their expectations in the future. So I put a shop in town that had magic items, but they were all wonky. Like every single item something was wrong with it. And so it went wrong in a funny way, because they picked up the one thing that I described, which I hadn't prepared anything for, which was just this kind of, I had made a description of a wooden face mask that was lying in the shop. And I was just kind of covering items, and I just wanted to kind of impress how pointless everything was in there. and I just described like similar to a yo-yo and whatever other items were there, and most of them had magical properties, some of them didn't. But the wooden face mask came up, and I hadn't prepared anything. I hadn't even said it's not magical because I had just put it in the description, and I bought it, and I was like, shit, what do I do with this? And I improvised in that moment that it was possessed by a wizarding student whose spell had gone wrong, but that they, like, in that moment, I also decided that, so essentially from the lack of prep, really, for this one item, I created a whole storyline by accident where the wizarding student was trapped in there with a demon lord. And so he was really angry because he was being influenced by the demon lord he had trapped in there. And but my players kind of hated the item because he was always angry, except for one of the players who loved it, so always would whip it out and start talking to it. And that kind of caused a little bit of tension in the group for a while before we modulated it back. I was still newer to DMing as well, so I took some time to kind of adjust to that. But I think that would be one of the situations where I guess not necessarily prep went wrong, because when I do prep, I'm generally quite happy with having it, regardless of how well it fits in or whatever, but I'm happy to have the prep. But it was more that I had prepped differently than I usually did, and in that description, something came out that just kind of bit me in the ass. So
and you learn from then, prepare better.
Yeah, especially magic items, just have something ready.
Or say no. If they look at something, just don't give in to the player expectations.
Absolutely.
There's nothing magical about it. No, seriously, there's not. I can empathise. Chris Roberts, who plays Hrathia in the Runekeep, has said, Simon, tell them about the flat cap of hindsight. I feel like I have to, although it's going to be somewhat embarrassing for me. So the flat cap of hindsight was an item that I created back in 2nd edition. So most of the magic items in my campaign, if not all, are created by me. And I think, Kevin, you're going to think of this item and just think, it's great, it's really useful. So what the flat cap does is, when you put the cap on, if you put it on normally, you see backwards. Okay. So you can be in disguise and kind of be facing one way, but you're actually looking the other way.
That's brilliant.
And you see? What's wrong with that? But the most useful thing they ended up using it for is to avoid the gaze of a Medusa or something. I don't know, something like that.
Ah, that's very cool. I mean, that's a brilliant magical item. In fact, I want to steal it. Like, that's super
Go ahead.
Cool.
Please, let's make it a meme. Just spread around all great campaigns everywhere. The flat cap of hindsight, just as revenge for asking that question.
The best part should be that when you wear it the wrong way around, the only thing is that you realize that you should not have done that.
Yeah. I mean, I think they spent most of the time with the cap going backwards, but then that makes you look a bit like a baseball player, so that was just embarrassing. But no, in a more serious sort of something that I need to learn from and was more recent. In preparation for the stream, we had an intro of a main character called Serene, and I'd prepared in my head, like I'd been talking about, this scene where they first interact with this very dangerous character who is extremely threatening and so on. And I started the scene and it was going really well. And then Hrathia grappled her and she ended up flat on her back for most of the scene.
Oh no.
And at the time the character didn't want to just kill them. So I basically had very few options. I spent the entire time trying to work out how this amazing character would get out of it, and in the end, it turned out into quite a good RP moment for the conversations and everything that was going on. But I suspect the threat felt a little bit diminished at the end of that. So what did I learn from that? I still feel like I haven't worked out what I learned from that. I think the answer is that players will always surprise you and you have to roll with it, and that's life. And you can't, no matter how much you want to manipulate and create an atmosphere or a scene or an event, the most important thing is just to let the players have their fun. And
Definitely. And I think maybe another takeaway can be that, you know, it is, first of all, really difficult to set up legitimately threatening characters, because if you put them in a one-on-one confrontation with the party, the party is typically outnumbers a single character. So that always...
Yeah, in 5th edition, it's a big problem.
Threat. Yeah. And so you have to kind of... I genuinely think that, because that's probably a good point that I've done wrong in the past several times. Once with a hag that almost ended up killing one of my new players in the first session because they underestimated the threat from the hag, which had a cone of cold, and they were level 4. So that did 66 damage to a bard who had like 25 HP, I think. But they somehow survived. I don't recall exactly. But like making your bad guys threatening the right way is such an important skill, right? Because if you do it right, it's incredibly valuable. If you do it wrong, it's actually deadly to the party sometimes, because even if you do it wrong and they don't take it seriously, there can be some serious threat behind that where they may just die if they take the wrong move. Yeah. So,
all right. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all these amazing questions. I didn't really expect the chat to explode like this. Kevin and I had prepared 20 questions each or something, and I think we got through like 4.
So, yeah, pretty much.
So thank you very much for joining us. It seems like we'll have to do another DM chat again soon.
Yes.
But for now, we'll be saying goodbye, and thank you again.
Thank you guys so much.
I should say this is Kevin from Chaotic Stupid Media. Please check his stream out, Tales of Edea. Is that how you pronounce it?
Tales of Edea.
Edea.
Yeah, I'm weird about E's. I don't know, but all my names have weird E's in them.
Yeah, which is a very cool campaign with lots of intrigue and interesting characters. So do check that out, and thank you for joining us again.
And likewise, by the way, if you guys are new here, you should follow the Ruined Keep, because it's amazing. And I love the stream, and I hang out here every single Tuesday when we're streaming. So definitely come hang out with us for this amazing story as well.
All right, have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday, hopefully.
Yeah. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.